Hey, it's the Rican, and I'm glad to welcome back Michael Johns. He graciously is doing my show again, and we got so much stuff going on around the world. And when I have questions about foreign policy, he's the guy I turn to. So, how you doing today, John? Michael. Sorry.
Very good. Very good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So I wanted to talk to you about everything that's going on here with Ukraine, and Biden just deployed 3,000 more troops to Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
and you know,
Well, look, let's start with the comparison, I think, between the 4 years of Trump and the, relative containment and stability that he brought to our Russia policy with the aggression that we're now seeing under Biden. I mean, it's a clear night and day situation. So, if you go back during Obama, of course, is when Putin moves to seize Crimea. He provided no lethal support to Ukraine, despite the fact that the evidence of Putin's, aggression was fairly self-evident to anyone who was observing. In fact, I can remember back then that this is sort of a side story, but a personal one. That Jon Stewart's producers have reached out to me, wanting to talk about the Crimean, invasion and the Crimea seizure, and I had this sense, like they're trying to make it seem like we were overreacting to it. We as conservatives, and me particularly as an anti-communist conservative, known, kind of for my the role in the Cold War perspective, that somehow we hadn't adjusted our feeling. And of course, it's completely contradictory then with the 4 years of paranoia during Trump, where the allegations are made that somehow he's operating, in some sort of subordinate role to Putin.
Yeah. I was going to say that reminds me of when was it when Romney was running against Obama, when he said that, the 90s called and I want your foreign policy back.
Yeah. That was a great line, but then in reality, you just look. I think the conclusion you can very easily reach, and one I reached a long time ago, is what is the Democrat position on Russia? Well, it's sort of like whatever's politically convenient at the moment. Now, the troop presence on the Ukraine border is a serious threat right now, and it's one we should take seriously. Russia is probably not the greatest of all of our security and threats that we do face in the world. I think China's Communist Party supplanted them fairly good number of years ago. But what's intriguing here is you sort of have a soft position by Obama. You get Putin has a good sense of these things, moves and annexes Crimea. Trump comes in and provides the lethal support to the Ukraine government that really, I think, sends the message to Moscow that this sort of aggression, will be met with force, and that Ukraine's defense and their autonomy was one that would be taken seriously. We know that Putin, former KGB agent, it has sort of a lot of frustration, really, at the way the Cold War tore the former Soviet Union apart, which of course was a wholly unnatural empire that deserved to be torn apart and that wanted to be torn apart.
Well, it's funny that you compare it to the Trump, because I was gonna say, I remember I had for the longest, I don't know if it's still, I had a pinned tweet on my Twitter that said basically that, because they always complained about Trump being this crazy guy, and that we were going to be, I remember when he got elected, they're like, oh, we're going to go to war, and it's like,
of course, just the opposite. Really on every front. The relationships with our allies improved measurably, and by that I mean not just that we got along, but he urged them to step up and to live up to their obligations. And you start with NATO. We need a real serious rethinking even of what NATO is in 2022. I was shocked to hear with Biden defense officials, referring to our Article 5, I guess, obligations under NATO for collective defense, when Ukraine, of course, there's been some discussion about hypothetically including them in NATO, but they're not a NATO member. No. Turkey is a NATO member. We would send Americans under our current NATO obligations to defend Turkey, and a good number of countries, including Germany, which has just entered into this very dependent energy relationship with Moscow. So, the cohesive, and an alliance is great as theory. Everyone praises alliances, but they're only valuable if you're operating cohesively. And we have seen now a good number of indications, whether it's been Turkey's decision to purchase Russian defense, air defense equipment, which it could potentially now have access to our fighter jets and the technology that we utilize, or whether it's Merkel's previous decision on the pipeline, the gas pipeline, which now places Germany fully dependent, largely dependent, I guess would be the way to word it, on Russia's energy production. Mm-hmm. Totally contradicting the operating thesis of NATO, which is, NATO is firstly a way too many things, in my judgment. You got a lot of, and a lot of it is fitting into this politically sort of politically correct agenda, a lot of environmental things, mm-hmm. a lot of projects that are way off the beaten path. And, a military alliance, first and foremost, has to be able to fight. And so even in the reference you just made to the Biden deployment, which itself is controversial, tough to see how that doesn't escalate it, but we better have a good sense that, that the threat is legitimate to be doing that. But the primary role of this is a military alliance, okay? There are shared political values largely, but it is a military alliance that needs to fight. And we don't even have, many of the NATO members living up to the 2% GDP obligation to contribute to the collective defense. So
that's why people were up at arms. People were up at arms with Trump about that, and it's like he's not trying to anger our allies. He's just getting them to live up to their expectations. When you signed into NATO, you were supposed to contribute. Well, I was looking at, I couldn't believe it was like some of them was 1%, some of them was 2%, and some of these countries for the longest were contributing less than 1%.
Right. So that also is, so it's not just the issue of the financial management of the collective defense of NATO, but it also sends a message globally about is this an alliance that's taking its mission seriously or not? Mm-hmm. So now those were goals, so in fairness, and we went through this global recession, and many of those countries argued that they were struggling, but in the case of Germany, I know they went into the Trump White House and said, look, we have a obligation constitutionally to be balancing our budget. And the Trump personnel correctly pointed out, hey, look, we'd love to be doing that too, but the issue is your balanced budget provisions are a product of a constitution we wrote after we drove the Nazis and liberated Germany from Nazi occupation. So anyway, this is a defining moment in world affairs. To cut to it, on the Russia-Ukraine, Biden policy, the Obama policy was weak. That's why Crimea is now been annexed. Trump, held Putin at bay for those 4 years. And he did it because he deployed the forces. He had these discussions, built the relationships, and and always was willing to talk, which is really the appropriate thing, is that you can confuse strength with, just being militarily oriented. That's a mistake that Biden's made here as well, is that, he's had fairly high level delegations engaged in discussions at a point where we're really not particularly strong. And we're had 100,000 Red Army troops, on the Ukraine border. Now, 100,000 troops is a very, very sizable number, even for a large army like Russia. And certainly you do that because you're trying to gain attention to some extent. Now, what are Putin's goals, I think, is ultimately the question here. One, or the worst case scenario is Putin, I think, would love to see the former Soviet Union, or at least parts of it, reconnected. Ukraine and Georgia are the two real key parts of that, and then the Baltics. So it's not an outrageous thesis that there's a potential military threat. But the other thing that I think he wants to do is really divide NATO. And the discussions that we've had very openly, very publicly, about putting Ukraine into NATO are, in the eyes of Russia, like it would be as if Mexico went into an alliance, say, with China's Communist Party. I mean, we would take that really seriously, obviously, right on our border, as we've taken all of our hemispheric threats seriously.
Like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, when, they 90 miles from our shore, nuclear missiles.
Yeah. And Kennedy handled that, successfully, ultimately successfully, in my view. But the lesson there to be learned is that, you don't want hostile regimes in proximity of your country. Look, Russia's a nuclear power. They remain a nuclear power, but they're also an economy that's roughly the size of Italy. This is not the Soviet Union. I spent the early parts of my career contributing really seriously with a good number of other conservatives who believed that we could win the Cold War and win it quickly. And that was, believe it or not, in retrospect, a laughable thesis in the minds of most on the left, even most in the established foreign policy, thought world. Just felt that there was simply no way that we could do that. But I'd been to the Soviet Union. I saw a number of things there that I thought were suggestive of really demoralized population, extraordinary poverty, a lack of cohesiveness, really, within the Soviet Union, and ultimately what I described as three kind of tiers of empires that were held together by force. One was this external empire of the developing, or third world, what we then called third world areas, where they'd invaded Afghanistan in 1979 under Carter. They had obviously gained a serious foot in Latin America with the fall of Somoza and their rule in Nicaragua. They were, as you correctly pointed out, present in Cuba since the Castro's rise in 1959, and then Angola was big in Africa, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. That was the external empire. And then you had this kind of the Warsaw Pact, obviously, kind of Central and Eastern Europe, so this external empire wanted out. They didn't view themselves as having any alliance with the Soviet Union. They didn't view themselves as communist, and they felt repressed. The countries of the Warsaw Pact felt like they were being put into this forced, community of nations held together by force from Moscow, and with this alien communist ideology that emerged in those countries, after liberation of and victory in World War II. And then you had the Soviet Union itself, which I said, really, when you looked at these countries, what did Siberia have in common with, say, Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, or Ukraine? These are
It's
countries.
it's crazy. I remember seeing something. This is Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia itself covers, I think it's 11 time zones. Is that correct? I don't know if you know that.
Yeah. Well, with the Eastern Reach, it's a lot of territory and a lot of time zones. But the point is that you had all of these countries with their own individual rich traditions of language, of religion and faith that were being suppressed, and of culture that were being repressed as part of the Lenin's 1917 and design, that was militantly enforced, then by Stalin and through the consecutive Kremlin leaders to really suppress these individual regional identities. And
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a
by way of saying that I do believe we're talking about all of a sudden China back in the news. I think the American people were waking up to the reality that we've been snoozing on the magnitude of threat that we face in all respects from China's Communist Party. But it's my thesis when I look at China today that it's very reminiscent to me of what we saw in the former Soviet Union in the late 1980s until through the winning the Cold War in 1991, and by that I mean the Tibetans, Hong Kong, Mongolia, all these, the East Turkestan region, as the Uyghurs call it. All of these are in, like the countries of the former Soviet Union, regions that had this very rich, lengthy historical tradition going way back before Mao's arrival in Beijing in 1949, that are being repressed, and that is kind of at the core of their human rights violations. And that's the tug of war going on in China right now, is one of these individual ethnic groups wanting to maintain the lengthy historical traditions they've had to their language, to their faith, and to their culture. And really a dictator in Xi Jinping, now president for life, who has a completely alternative vision of digesting and suffocating that expression of nationalism that he views as a threat. And he's particularly threatened by the Uyghurs, but you've seen the utilization of force and the suppression of this individuality in
you saw it. As they saw it in Hong Kong, with the way they
be clear, it was a treaty violation. I mean, this was not simply human rights violations, but this is yet again another treaty that Xi Jinping has violated. This was, the turning over of Hong Kong, which provided for, individual autonomy over the political, the legal structure of Hong Kong for 50 years. We were, not even halfway, but roughly halfway into that, and pulled the plug on it because they saw the magnitude of opposition that was emerging to their suppression of individual rights in Hong Kong. And it is a disaster that's been permitted to occur, because Hong Kong, where I've also been, with one of the great cities really of the world, one of the financial capitals of the East. And I haven't given up on that. I'm still hopeful that those brave people, and especially the youth movement there, will carry on, and got a number of Hong Kong young political leaders in prison right now, for a number of years for very minor offenses. And disappearances all over the place. So here's my point, though, on the big point on what's going on with Putin is the big point is the threat to Ukraine today is real, but it was real yesterday, the day before, last week, last month. What else is going on that makes this now, an issue of distraction, and why is it all of a sudden sort of risen to this level of prominence? And I think quite clearly it's a political tactic in a lot of ways to deflect from an economy that is collapsing, inflation that bad as it is right now. I mean, if you look at these wholesale numbers, once this floods through into retail, which is
today we reached $30 trillion in debt.
Horrible jobs numbers. Yep, horrible jobs numbers. A collapse really of the dollar's value. Threat to it is the reserve currency of the world, which it's historically been one of the keys to the greatness of this economy. This quite clearly a pandemic that he campaigned saying that he would somehow have some recipe for resolving. We think those of us close to it knew that was false, but it's been proven documentably untrue. Plenty of questions about these vaccines now as it relates to the variants and the fact that they're not as effective on the variants, that the continual boosts are potentially threatening as it relates to autoimmune and other diseases. The ridiculous world participation in these Olympics coming up here. We've labeled them genocidal, and let's be clear, where it all started, the open border, which is disgraceful, with these ghost flights, all of which are illegal, and a lot of us celebrated, and I'm sure you saw all the way to the Supreme Court victory on the stay in Mexico policy. And how does Biden respond? He's just violating it. He's violating, even when we do get these favorable rulings that compel compliance by the Biden administration to some degree of sensibility, when we've had over 2 million illegals.
Well, it's funny, like you were talking about with Trump and the foreign policy when it comes to how his how he held the ties together, how it wasn't so chaotic, and then here at home, they wanted to accuse him of being a dictator, but every time he lost court battles, he listened. If he lost the court battle, it's like, okay, what can we do? There's nothing we could do. Okay. Biden, on the other hand, he's losing court battles, like what was it, last summer with the eviction moratorium? The Supreme Court told him no. He rewrote it, and then they told him no again, and he finally stopped. But it's like, you can't.
What's most troubling, though, is I think any American who's really, and many Americans are, pausing to reflect on what's really going on here, right? I think it's on your mind. It's very much on my mind. And it's a tough question to answer, because you look at these policies, you see that they're self-sabotaging, right? So historically, we'd been engaged in what we used to call the battle of ideas, sort of between conservatives and progressives, Republicans and Democrats, the idea being that we both had different approaches that we felt would be most effective, but largely, even though I'm sure both sides would call each other misguided, we, at the end of the day, didn't doubt that the other side at least wanted the best outcome. They just had the wrong recipe for the crisis at hand. You can't look at any of the policy steps that have been taken from Afghanistan and the abandonment of Bagram Air Base. They're literally shutting the lights out. The Afghans wake up the next morning, no pre-notification of our departure. We leave a high security prison, completely unguarded, filled with really high, highly threatening terrorists, several thousand. And then, really the 6 weeks that follow, which is a complete, almost conscious strategic decision to hand this country to the Taliban, and not only to hand it to the Taliban, but to do it in a way that really projected our own weakness and our own unreliability, as it relates to the message that the world saw. And that's why
that's a reflection of Biden. I mean, Biden, he portrays weakness to the world, and even here at home.
Well, and that's my point, is that so if you go through and you look even on whether it's the CCP and the China threat, whether it's the way he's handled this border. I mean, the message is out all over the world. This isn't the illegal immigration that we experienced in the Obama years, where it was kind of you had some degree of coordination by the cartels. This is completely cartel run. It's being run like a business. Many of these individuals are being brought in here, particularly young people, for trafficking. And the fentanyl overdoses are already up. I think when you had me on last time, I mentioned one of my concerns, which I think I've been fairly alone in putting forward, but everyone knew that the heroin crisis that we've had kind of for it's roughly a 2-decade problem of overdoses was 95% of the poppy seeds used in heroin production come from Afghanistan. Well, now you have in China kind of this criminal, not kind of, really this criminal government that has already shown its willingness to commercialize, organs that they're taking out of people without even applying anesthesia for sale in a multi-billion-dollar industry, and drug trafficking with the vast majority, over 90% of fentanyl in the U.S. Coming out of China. And they already had the distribution and street network sort of established, and now it's very difficult to see. I mean, how they're not going to potentially exploit the poppy fields of Afghanistan that, in addition to the incredible mineral wealth.
Oh yeah, that's especially where
$1 trillion of, and not any types of minerals either, but you've got, a good number of the real vital minerals.
The rare earth minerals that you need. Like what I find ironic is like the green people on the left, they should be up at arms that we just gave China, vast amounts of lithium and those rare earth minerals used in, solar panels, batteries, stuff that they want for the green economy.
Design, right, it's about China's economic ascendance in a lot of ways. So those batteries are manufactured in China. That's good news for them. Meanwhile, how seriously are they taking the CO2 emissions and perceived global warming? They are far and away the world's largest polluter. And you look at CO2 emissions, you'll notice, that we're fairly flat for about a decade now, because we've taken all of these self-imposed steps to contain it, kind of on the operating thesis that it is in fact damaging and bad for the economy, and I think reasonable people can differ over the magnitude that's having. But we've done that, by the way, at the expense of jobs and wages, and full companies and industries have chosen to pick up and leave for places like China that have not had the restrictive measures in place, and they're doing absolutely nothing on it.
They still build coal power plants across China, and not like excuse me, not like our clean coal plants that they don't want us to use here. They got multiple scrubbers to clean out the air before it gets released.
These guys are building coal plants in a matter of weeks. They're putting them up,
Mhm.
in rapid succession. And I'm raising all this by way of following up on your very good point about the obvious hypocrisy of the left. Because if you look at what are the major issues that seem to really get under their skin historically, I think back about the post 9/11 issue with the Al Qaeda suspects being held at Gitmo. Remember all the protests and what those were, like legitimate terror suspects, not much doubt about that. And there were, a few hundred. You now have millions of individuals completely innocent who are being held in concentration camps in the Uyghurs by China's Communist
And
Party.
aren't they also harvesting the Uyghurs' organs too?
It's, and involving them in forced labor,
Mm-hmm.
and reprogramming them, really, in a way. That's the goal. The goal there are, I've always cautioned about comparing anything to the Holocaust, anything to Nazi Germany, but one of the commonalities is this desire to suppress and the religious orientation of the Uyghurs and their linguistic orientation, and to essentially exterminate them. I mean, they've been definitionally labeled by Mike Pompeo and the U.S. State Department as a genocidal regime. And that was great. That was done, as you might recall, after the 2020 election and before the inauguration of Biden. But where are the ramifications for it? I mean, genocide.
Speaking of ramifications, I remember, I forgot if it was Xi Jinping or someone else who was asked a question about the whole Uyghur stuff. And he's like, well, how dare you Americans ask us, come at us asking that type of question when you have, Black people dying in the streets by cops. And I'm just there like, see what happens when you feed a narrative to the world.
Allegation enacted with our first mini summit with them, where when the issue of standards of governmental conduct came up, and including, by the way, these aren't optional issues. These are agreements that we've signed through the UN, et cetera, on how people are to be treated and are codified both in global and in national law. I mean, including China's constitution, which isn't worth the paper it's written on. And that's what happens when you have a judicial system that's run, by the party. Everything's run by the party. Nothing gets done in China that the Communist Party is not involved.
Well, it's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship. So everything has to go to the party. I mean, was the guy, the Alibaba guy who disappeared for like 2 or 3 months and then came back and never said anything ever again?
Right. Well, and the suppression of speech and the redefinition of history. This is a regime, by the way, let's just not forget, that's taken 70, 80, 90 million lives since coming to power in 1949. It surpasses even Stalin in its killing of innocent life. And it is an enormously strategically inclined, thoughtful, disciplined party that is got very strong criminal orientations and no ethical restraint. In many ways, that's the most dangerous sort of enemy you can confront, in the sense that their ambitions are lofty and they have no ethical constraint whatsoever on what they are prepared to do. So people disappear in China all the time.
So let me ask you a question. Why do you think China, if you look what's going on between, like, let's say with Ukraine and Russia right now, and compare like what's going on between Taiwan and China, why do you think that Biden is focusing on the Ukraine issue
That's a
versus
great,
focusing on Taiwan?
so we've had all these sortie flights and over into Taiwan's airspace, and the verbal aggression of kind of forcing onto them this idea that they are not an individual nation, and the insistence that they've had. Remember when Trump actually put the call into Taiwan after his election, and they blew up that call was even made. So they have clear designs in that region. They've been building these military islands throughout the South China Sea. By the way, destroying all of the coral undersurface of the sea and doing it. There's no environmental outrage on that. But there's a lot of Chinese money, by the way, in many of these environmental groups in the U.S.
Oh yeah.
We had functioning media, they would, I think, look into this, investigate it, and uncover it.
Of course. I mean,
very good point. What is the greater threat right now? Is it?
Well, I was going to say not just in the companies.
A lot of people believe could happen post Olympics.
I was going to say not just the companies, but to add on, you also have like the Confucius organization that has like the that has member groups in colleges teaching about Chinese communism and our universities across the country.
Right, they come in sort of smiling with these very seemingly benign aspirations of just educating and teaching Mandarin, and next thing you know, the curriculums are being restructured, and along with them are usually what are some exchange students or temporary students that are really operating completely within the command of the CCP's intelligence direction. And this is part of what's been going on for decades now, is that we have a thesis that exists, is that the idea of the U.S. in managed decline is one that's been sold to the elite governance, kind of starting with Kissinger and then moving onward. I had a lot of direct conversations with U.S. officials even before going into government in the 80s, because a lot of these things made no sense, including handing Hong Kong off to them, as you will call it, was part of the British domain of countries, and the rights violations that went all the way back to that era, and the timid response on Tiananmen Square, in my view, and the economic practices of that have been completely disproportionate and unfair to the American worker. So the country's got to awaken to the magnitude of these threats, what the CCP is doing now in space with the projection of force in space, and the utilization of some very immensely threatening high-tech and military technology developments that would alter the complete dynamics of ground warfare in the United States should things come to that, and the buildup of their nuclear arsenal, which continues to grow, and the buildup of their Navy fleet, which grows. And ours is what I can remember in the 80s with Reagan talking about a 600 ship Navy, and we've got a very diminished naval capacity compared to that, and it's so vital. I mean, it's the strongest in the world still, but it's keeping these regions free, including the South China Sea, which would be completely taken over by China by now, were it not for the U.S. leadership. But we've got to be confronting these challenges, and I think what concerns me about the sort of rapid emergence of this Russia issue is that you've got a Biden-Harris administration, both of them in complete free fall on their polling, and why not? I mean, there was not a lot of enthusiasm for their candidacies to begin with. Plenty of legitimate questions about the legitimacy of the election itself that most Americans want resolved. And then, from the economy to the border to foreign affairs, to this Afghanistan collapse, which is probably the greatest, almost certainly the greatest national security setback for the United States of America in the post-war period. It matches the fall of Saigon and surpasses that, perhaps, in the long-term detrimental effects that it potentially represents.
Well, I won't disagree. That's why I'm pushing. We need to go out and vote. I know people are discouraged because of what happened in 2020, but in order for things to change, you gotta go out there, and it's not because people want to vote during the presidential election years, but people forget to vote between the election years. Those are your local officials, your local congressman is gonna be able to go there and enact change, maybe not as quickly as people would like, but let's say for right now, if the Republicans could flip the House and flip the Senate, then a lot of these, maybe you could do something like basically what happened with Clinton in the 90s when what's this guy's name? Gingrich. When Gingrich took over in the 90s and forced Clinton to to do more moderate conservative policies.
Well, that's 11 months away, and then of course, even if we have the great outcome that I think many of us would expect, if we can have a free and fair election, would have, picking up, maybe as many as 80, 90, 100 seats. I mean, a sweeping victory that surpasses even the Tea Party revolution of 2010, which was the largest in the United States history since the 30s. Mm-hmm. You see all the signs of that occurring, but there's a lot of footnotes that I have to put behind it. Number one is our side, we need to be forceful. I mean, the American people want to see some strength. They're tired of what they see as kind of a controlled opposition, that kind of mouth the words. Great Senate press conference today, by the way, on the border, and easily half a dozen Republican senators saying all the things I would say. But where's the plan? I mean, we need to be acting, and especially given the fact that you got this administration operating in violation of the federal order as it relates to the stay in Mexico policy, and is engaged in flights of these illegals, ghost flights, all over the country and into these states without any notification of state officials. These are illegal and impeachable acts.
Mm-hmm. I don't care that it would give us Harris, but with all these impeachable offenses that Biden has done, the Republicans need to get a backbone and press for impeachment. It's like, even if
time's not on our side. I mean, I think this is one of the, if you feel like we can kind of dig ourselves into this on all fronts with continued national security and foreign policy setbacks, continued, devaluation of the dollar and inflation, continued issues as it relates to overreactions or hugely devastating the economy on COVID, and the 2 million run rate or more of who knows who is coming into this country. By the way, 115 or so countries. Turns out all over the world, basically that we have no border, no interest really in protecting the border.
And then you have states like New York. You have New York City. I don't know if you heard that they just passed that, you don't have to be a citizen to vote in New York City elections.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is not an issue of bad policy. These are like flagrantly illegal acts. And then, of course, even with the new DA in New York City that just took office
Yeah.
last, already, indicating that he's not going to prosecute resistance of arrest, police
The one that was most egregious to me, because my parents still live in New York, was that someone could pull a gun on them, rob them, and instead of being charged with armed robbery, which is a felony and holds 10 years in jail, they would get petty larceny that holds 364 days. So not even a year, 364 days.
Meanwhile, she had walked into the Capitol casually on January 6th and had been at Trump's speech and walked out and done no damage. You've been interviewed by the FBI, you've been indicted, and you're being held without bail in isolation right now in that horrific DC prison. We have all the signs really of the diminishment and demise of representative government and the rule of law. And all of which comes full circle to the big question that I think we're not asking and need to be asked. Is it clearly we have an administration engaged right now in the destruction, the conscious destruction of this country and its foundations in ways that may not be repairable? What would motivate such an act? Because, like I said, historically, you would go back and you would see damaging policies often put into place when we will lose these debates or lose elections. But it would be the opportunity to self-correct, and bad policies, when they were kind of became apparent, were not working, would continue to be challenged, and oftentimes you'd see the reversal. There clearly were political designs involved in a lot of initiatives, but at the end of the day, both parties valued and believed this was the greatest country in the United States and took their constitutional, their vows of protection of our Constitution and the protection of our country from enemies domestic and abroad with great seriousness. There's absolutely no way that you can look at this administration, which is violating the rule of law on a daily basis with complete disregard and in pursuit of policies that themselves don't even make any sense, unless the goal is to diminish the country and to remove it from its historical role as the freest and greatest nation in the world. And of course, increasingly, those who've looked at this global reset agenda, this Davos agenda, believe that's what we're experiencing. So it's we have domestic actors at play in it, but it's a global design that
what we should do, that let's save that discussion, like that great reset discussion, let's save that for another show, because I think that's something that we could do a whole another hour on, is talking about that great reset. Because I think all that we talked about today, everything that's going on, I think it boils down to that's the end game, is the diminishment of the US by years of bad policy on both sides, not just right now. It's
these are people and a complete disregard for mankind and the wellness of fellow humans. I mean, there is nothing compassionate about this open border. These women raped, they're dying, they're dying on the way here. They're put into positions of criminality and forced situations that they didn't ask for. And it's all enriching, basically the cartels and diminishing the United States, and certainly proving immensely burdensome to communities they're going to have to absorb. Um, these individuals are just being flown in complete violation of law. Same in Afghanistan, where I continue to be bombarded with Afghans who cooperated with us during this 20-year war and are running for their lives from the Taliban, and some of whom I know for a fact have been viciously killed just since August 15th. So we need to turn this around, and it's going to require a lot of unity and over communication. Strategy, and that's the other missing link here, is that
I think
we can't beat evil, and this is evil. A lot of the aspects are evil,
and I think it's going to take time. Like people, the U.S., we want instant gratification, but to correct, to fix everything that's going on, it's going to take, let's say, more than one administration coming in to fix all the issues that's happened. It's like we can't be.
You go back to the founders also, I think, because the founders were very instructive in saying, like, look, we've laid out this really great system of government, but it's only as strong as the individuals who are governing it, and that remains one of the great challenges that we confront. Is we were founded by individuals of great faith, with incredible entrepreneurial, hardworking, and bold.
Yeah. I think it was Madison. Was it Madison who said, like, when they founded the country, they said that the citizen, oh my goodness, tongue tying there. The citizenry needed to be a moral, upstanding people, and without being a moral, upstanding people.
Just the idea, we'll just start with the idea of understanding the responsibilities of citizenship, because I don't, really, we can't sustain the country with only this elite number of, a few hundred or a few thousand individuals making these decisions. That was that was and continues to be the genius of the Tea Party movement. I think it's the genius of the MAGA movement as well. But we need to be bold. We need to understand the magnitude of what we're confronting, and that as much as it seems inconceivable, the freedoms that we've historically enjoyed in this country are not preordained to sustain themselves without a vigorous citizenship and citizen base that is prepared to defend them from those who would undermine them.
And that's why when I talk on my show, I talk about how, like they're talking about making voting easier. And I'm like, to me, voting, I'm not saying it should be super hard to vote, but it shouldn't be as easy as, you send me a piece of paper and I'm going to go right and fill out. No, you should have to go in person. It should be a little inconvenient. I'm not saying it should be impossible. It should be a little inconvenient that you have to go to, do your civic duty. Now,
so it's so simple if common sense were applied, but when you want to, rely on fraudulent voting practices, as they have, excluding, say, the General Assembly, and putting out these boxes, and and not having the statutory required chain of command on balloting. These are serious issues, and I have to ask, we're blaming the left, we're blaming these so-called rhinos that didn't, and which clearly in Kemp in Georgia and UC in Arizona didn't stand up for this. But where are all of these institutions that, for my 30 years of involvement in this political process, have said the Constitution was so vital and important? They are totally silent on this issue, neither validating nor contradicting the operating thesis of the Navarro reports and the Texas AG filing with the Supreme Court, and the former president's position, which seems sensible, that at least in these 6 states, and possibly and likely elsewhere, there were substantial issues of irregularities and fraud, and which is what we wanted done on January 6th. Remember, I mean, this was the idea was to send these back, and the states were asking that it be sent back so they could consider recertifying the results in accordance with the information that they had learned since they had submitted their electoral votes. And that did not happen, and was, I think, an enormous disservice and an enormous disruptive step as it relates to our confidence in the system, whatever would have ultimately come of that. So whether they would have in fact reversed and seen Trump go back over 270, which wouldn't have taken more than 3 states if there were
it would have just been like what, Pennsylvania? It could have even just been 2 states, like Pennsylvania and like Wisconsin or something like that.
Both 10, I think. So very nice to see you again. And unfortunately, I think the enemies and bad guys of the world are on the move tonight, both in China, Russia, Iran, which we didn't talk about, Venezuela, Cuba, which I'm sure that you're concerned with as well. And we need to be exerting our leadership. And by the way, there's positional leadership and there's kind of situational leadership. So we don't have the positional leadership right now with government in the hands of Democrats, but we do have the situational opportunity to exert our leadership. And that's what I'm urging all people to do, and to do it in a unified way. And feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at my name, Michael Johns, one word. I know you were going to ask this, so I'm just going to put it in. Or on Facebook, Michael Johns Tea Party, or any of the other emerging platforms, because we're only as effective really as we are unified, and we need to do really do a much better job and take a look at restructuring even how we approach a lot of these things, given the rapid setback that we've had over the last few decades. Not in the loss of elections necessarily, because we've actually won more elections than we've lost, but in the demise and deterioration and surrender of the most important institutions of civil society have fallen in fairly fast and consecutive.
I think to me, the one of the biggest things is, especially like academia, it's like we have no representation in academia. That
raises this point. I said that if you this is kind of where I'm going with it, is if we said, okay, whoever with billions of dollars that have flooded into the conservative movement since the early 80s, let's say, who is responsible for making sure that academia didn't fall 95% into the hands of the socialist, globalist, Marxist left? I'm sure who we should go fire, and that's a sign that structurally or operationally we're not functioning as a movement. We're functioning as individuals, and largely a lot of duplication of effort and a lack of strategy that put us at an enormous deficiency. And we're still fighting like we're in a battle of ideas. I think we are in a battle of ideas, but we're dealing with a lot of street tactics now. And essentially,
I think just to get it to a conclusion today, I think what's the problem is that as conservatives, as libertarians, we're individuals, we're individualistic, versus the left, they're naturally collectivists.
Yeah, well, that's like playing football and saying you don't want to get your pants dirty, because sadly, this can be a rough and tumble field, and it gets particularly rough when you're not standing up for yourselves, and we don't. We throw our people under the bus all the time, and we don't address these situations with the counterpunches they require. And I just laid out, and you and I discussed, good number of enormously serious threats to this country, where if you ask me what is, the current plan of our leadership in Congress in McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, I don't know. I say that as someone in routine touch with these offices. I'm telling you, I don't know. I think they're focused on their rhetorical approach and what they should be saying. But we literally have guys down there now, launching podcasts, and they're members of Congress. I mean, no, you got to be. We need legislative strategies and tactics.
Well, I don't mind, like, let's say, like Ted Cruz has a podcast, I think with the Daily Wire. I don't. I understand wanting to go into that realm to get your message out, but also you have to. It's not you could talk all the game that you want, but you have to be strong, and you have to also be that pit bull that we need you to be in Congress.
That's right. And procedurally, we're going to change some things because it's very difficult, even if you're inclined to be a pit bull on some of these issues, to do that when all the power, as far as legislative agendas and what does and does not come to the floor of the House or the Senate, is in the hands of just a small number of leadership.
Of course, yeah.
So
and those people have been there way too long. Like we need like a convention of states, so like that we could get term limits done, because
I realize, of course, firstly with term limits, I'm not a fan of the convention states. Real quickly, I know we're wrapping up here, but firstly, convention states will be open to anyone. So if you want a rapid secession threat to the Second Amendment, that would.
Oh no, I understand there's threats to it, but to me, to get term limits, then they're going to vote it themselves.
But if we're going to term limits are a great idea. But if we need them most desperately, because they're not held to any public account, are in the executive branch of the administration, in the and bureaucracy, and what we call the deep state now, of individuals who are never elected by anyone. So clearly there's abuse, and our founders didn't intend for our legislature to be comprised of professional politicians that spent 40 and 50 years there.
Yeah.
But they certainly, even more so, did not want a permanent bureaucracy that was literally governing and undermining, as they did with Trump and elected.
That administrative state, you don't even need to call it a deep state, because it makes it sound, nefarious. It's just an administrative state that these people, even not even just the FBI. I was reading a story the other day where you get people, let's say you get new members in the House, a new congressperson comes in. They just hire staff that just sit there and they just wait for, these politicians to come in and hire them. They don't bring in, like, let's say, new people from their district. They just hire whoever's there in Washington.
Oh yeah, and part of it is because of the complexity that we consciously make this complex. So, for instance, you want to get a bill introduced, it's very unlikely that you have on your personal staff, and I say this having worked in the Senate, someone who can write a bill. There's people that just do the bills, and the leadership needs to make those people available to a member of Congress, and they can just say no and do that. That's not uncommon. They don't like the language, or they don't like the initiative. They'll not even make the resources available to you. And at that point, is this really a functioning representative democracy at that point? And so we've always talked historically, I'm sure you have historically, about the not taking for granted the founding principles of the country and the freedoms and the rule of law. But this is no longer just rhetoric. This is the real situation that we confront right now. And Americans need to view it as a definitional moment, because we're not likely going to sustain ourselves in the status quo. We're going to win and turn this around, or we're going to lose. I believe that this is going to come out one of the two ways.
I 100% agree. I think that's a great place that we could leave it. But you already said where you could be reached. I'll put it into the description where you could be reached. Thank you for coming on again. As always, insightful, great conversation, as always. And for the people who come in who follow you, I'm the right Rican, and I'm just one show at a time. I try to get people on, interesting people to talk to. I try to um, get stories out there that people not necessarily talking about, and these issues here that need to be discussed that sometimes people just don't take the time to listen or read or pay. The media tries to tell us one thing, and we have to be able to get for ourselves what's really going on. So let me stop ranting. Thank you again. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Follow Michael Johns on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter or any other social media you like. And please give me a like and subscribe on Rumble and YouTube. That being said, have a good one.